The black Bentley slowed down behind her on purpose. It drifted toward the flooded gutter, then accelerated, and the water came up over her like a thrown wave. The box in her arms went down with her. 40 loaves of bread, shaped by hand at 4 that morning, rolled across the wet concrete and were gone. Inside the car, a woman lifted her phone and laughed. The man behind the wheel didn't drive away. He wanted to sit there and watch, because the woman kneeling in that dirty water wasn't a stranger to him. She was the wife he had stood in front of television cameras and destroyed 3 years earlier. With tears in his eyes and one carefully chosen word, she was 30 years old. Her hands were covered in small burn scars from 15 years of ovens, and around her left wrist she wore a frayed apron string she had never once taken off. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She picked up every ruined loaf, put it back in the box, stood up, and kept walking. And that was the part nobody watching could understand. Why wouldn't a woman like that fight back? What Weston Ashcroft didn't know, as he sat in his car laughing, was that his ex-wife had married again. He didn't know her new last name. He didn't know that in 3 states, people lowered their voices when they said it. And he had no idea that he'd just been recorded doing the stupidest thing he'd ever done in his life, in a city where he was a guest and didn't know it. So who did she marry, and why has she kept it from everyone, even the people who stand beside her in that kitchen every morning? Why does a man with that kind of name spend 1 morning a week peeling potatoes in a shelter where nobody knows who he is? And what really happened 3 years ago in that restaurant? The night 31 people were carried out, and 1 woman was left to carry all of it alone? If this story pulls you in, leave a like, share it with someone who'd understand it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that sidewalk, and to the woman who kept walking. The morning prayer shelter stood at the end of a quiet road, and Sloane went around to the back door as she always did, except this time she walked more slowly, because every step drew another thin seep of water from the legs of her pants. She set the box of bread down on the doorstep without opening the lid, then went straight into the storage room behind the kitchen, where an old shirt hung waiting. One she kept there for days when the heat from the ovens became too much. She changed in the dark without turning on the light. When she came out, Yvonne Prescott was standing at the sink with a rag still in her hand, and she looked Sloane up and down exactly once. The mud along the hem of Sloane's pants had darkened and dried into a stiff border. Sloane said the bread box had slipped from her hands at the corner, her voice as ordinary as if she were talking about the weather, then added that she would make another batch in time for breakfast. Yvonne was silent for a few seconds. She had worked there long enough to understand that some questions were better left unasked, and that some people would speak when they were ready. And if they were never ready, that was their right too. She only nodded, told her there was still yeast in the pantry, then turned back to her stack of dishes. Sloane set a pot of water on the stove. She took out the flour, the salt, and the yeast, and began the second batch of dough that day, as though the first had never existed. Warm water flowed into the flour. Her fingers pressed and smoothed against the wooden work table, and for a long while the kitchen held nothing but the soft thud of dough and the faint rising song of water beginning to boil. Then the door flew open, and Delaney Fisk came running in. 18 years old, her hair tied back in haste, a ration notebook still clutched in one hand. She asked 3 questions before she even stopped to breathe. Whether the bread would have honey that morning, why Sloane was making a new batch, and whether she needed help. And Sloane laughed, the first sound of laughter that had left her since she stepped through the back door. She drew Delaney closer, scattered a small handful of flour across the table, then took the girl's hand and showed her how to dust the surface evenly without letting the flour gather into lumps. She told her to let it fall from high above, not to fling her hand, not to rush, because the flour would find its own place. Delaney tried, made a mess of it, laughed, and tried again. And on the 3rd attempt, the table was covered in such a fine, beautiful layer of white that the girl cried out in delight. Sloane told her she had done well. She said that one day, when someone walked into a kitchen and saw a table dusted with flour that way, they would know at once that someone had truly cared. Delaney blushed, then ran off to fetch the trays, then came running back with another question, and Sloane answered each one patiently, never once seeming hurried. Though the apron tie around her left wrist was still damp and bore a faint streak of mud she hadn't yet had time to wash away. When the final tray had been pushed into the oven, and Delaney had gone out to arrange the dining tables with the other volunteers, the kitchen grew quiet again. Sloane stood there alone with her back to the door, both hands resting against the edge of the table, and only then, When there was no one left to see, did her hands begin to tremble. At first it was barely there, only a faint quiver at her fingertips. Then it crept upward into her wrists, until both hands were shaking so hard that the thin dusting of flour on the backs of them drifted down onto the table in tiny white grains. She watched them tremble as though they belonged to someone else. She didn't cry. She didn't sit down. She only stood there and waited, the way a person waits for a storm to pass. And when the trembling still refused to stop, she slowly closed both hands into fists and squeezed as tightly as she could, tight enough that the old burn scars across her knuckles turned pale. She held them that way for a long time. Then she opened her hands, saw that they had gone still, and reached for the towel draped over the back of a chair to wipe down the table. Outside, the scrape of chairs across the floor announced that the first people had arrived. Yvonne leaned her head through the doorway and asked whether everything would be ready in time. Sloane looked up at the clock on the wall, then at the oven door glowing with warm golden light, and she answered in the voice of someone who had settled that question with herself a very long time ago, saying that people didn't remember who came late that day. They only remembered whether there had been bread that morning. Sloane pulled the fresh batch of dough toward her and began to knead, and some things returned only when both hands were occupied. Long ago, there had been a wooden table like this one, only smaller, in a diner tucked between two rows of aging buildings in Philadelphia, where the sign above the door bore nothing but the owner's name. Sloane had been 15 then. 6 moves, and 6 times she had learned not to unpack her suitcase completely. That morning, she stood across the street and watched as the diner door opened at 4 o'clock in the morning, spilling a long ribbon of golden light across the pavement that was still dark. The woman standing in the doorway was named Odette Lanier, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she didn't ask who Sloane was, where she had come from, or where she intended to go. She only tilted her head toward the inside of the diner, as though Sloane had been expected, then turned and walked back in. Sloane followed. Odette placed a plate of warm bread in front of her, pushed a jar of honey closer, then turned away and went back to her work, leaving Sloane to eat alone without anyone watching her. That was what Sloane remembered most clearly. Not the bread, but the fact that no one watched her eat. There was already another girl in the kitchen, a few years older than Sloane, 18, named Camille, who was arranging freshly baked trays and looked up at her with the eyes of someone who understood exactly what had just happened outside that door, because she had once crossed that threshold herself. Camille didn't say hello. She simply pushed a clean apron toward Sloane and told her that if she planned to stay, she needed to tie back her hair. From that day on, Sloane stayed. The two of them grew up together behind the kitchen counter, sharing the morning shift and the afternoon shift, sharing the folding bed in the small room above the diner, sharing even the times Odette scolded them for burning a batch or letting the dough rise too long. Camille taught Sloane how to hold a knife. Sloane taught Camille how to judge a flame. They called each other sisters, and for many years that word was true. Truer than any paper anyone had ever signed on Sloane's behalf. Odette never called them foster daughters, and she never called them workers. She simply called them by their names, and whenever she needed to speak of them to someone else, she said, "These are my 2 girls." She taught Sloane that dough never lied, that it would be honest about exactly what had been put into it, and that if the bread failed to rise one day, she shouldn't blame the dough, but should think back and remember where she had been too hurried. Then one summer, Camille took the money from the register and disappeared. There was no letter, no note, only the drawer hanging open and her apron draped over the back of a chair. Sloane was the first to discover it, and she stood there for a long time before she found the courage to go upstairs and wake Odette. Odette came down, looked at the open drawer, looked at the apron, then sat in a chair and remained silent for a very long while. Sloane waited for her to become angry. She didn't. She only said the girl would come back, then stood, retied her scarf, and opened the diner on time as she did every day. Sloane couldn't understand it. She asked how Odette could say such a thing, and Odette answered that she didn't know what the girl had needed the money for, and until she knew, she had no right to pass judgment. Sloane heard those words, but she couldn't swallow them. Odette forgave. Sloane didn't forget. It was the first time in her life she understood that she and that woman were different in one place, a distance she might never be able to bridge for as long as she lived. Camille never came back. The years passed. The diner still opened at 4 o'clock every morning, and Sloane grew older behind that kitchen counter, learning everything Odette had to teach, then teaching herself the things Odette didn't know how to teach. Until the day Odette's hands began to tremble, and she placed the oven brush in Sloane's hands. When Odette died, she left the diner to Sloane. Not a sum of money, not a long final message, only that diner, with that kitchen, with the sign above the door still bearing her name. It was the first home Sloane had ever known, and it was the only one. In the shelter kitchen, Sloane's hands were still kneading the dough, steady and even, never moving a beat faster or a beat slower. The dough beneath Sloane's hands had begun to smooth, and she folded it over, pressed it down, turned it a quarter turn, then folded it again, following the rhythm Odette had once taught her to count by breath rather than by numbers. Weston Ashcroft walked into that diner one afternoon, shortly after losing his management job at a restaurant on the main avenue, and while searching for somewhere that sold cheap coffee where he could sit for a while. He had the kind of face people wanted to look at a second time, the kind of voice that made strangers want to believe him, and an ambition so clean and polished that Sloane had mistaken it for idealism then. He barely knew how to cook. He knew it, and he said so plainly during his first week, saying he didn't need to know how to cook. He only needed to find someone who did. They talked after closing, night after night, about a restaurant that didn't yet exist, about a menu no one had written, about a name no one had ever read. Then came the need for money. The bank rejected him the first time, then the second, then the third, and each time he returned to sit at the corner table in the diner, remaining silent longer than before. Sloane couldn't remember the exact night she made her decision. She only remembered standing in the kitchen for a very long time, one hand resting on the wooden table that had worn into a shallow hollow after so many years, and thinking of Odette, thinking that the woman had given her a home, and perhaps the right thing to do with that gift was to turn it into something larger. She sold the diner. People came to take measurements, remove the sign, and carry away each oven one by one. She stood and watched everything, never stepping away, until the room was completely empty. The only thing she kept was Odette's apron, the one that had hung behind the kitchen door, and even that apron eventually rotted away, leaving nothing but its tie. The years that followed rushed past like one long fever. The restaurant opened, then filled with customers, then another opened, and then another, and every new opening meant Sloane slept a little less. She slept on the bench in the storeroom so many nights that the early morning delivery men became accustomed to knocking softly. She wrote down every recipe by hand, in cheap notebooks bought from a grocery store, recording every ratio, every temperature, every small trick known only to the person standing beside the oven. Weston memorized them. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, holding the notebook, reading each page over and over. Not so he could cook, but so he could tell the story. He practiced speaking about each dish as though it had emerged from his own memories, practiced where to pause, where to lower his voice, even the exact moment to place a hand against his chest while speaking of some imaginary grandmother who had passed the secret down to him. Once, Sloane heard him rehearsing in front of the mirror in the changing room, retelling the exact recipe she had written 3 nights earlier, and telling it so beautifully that for a single instant, even she almost believed him. She had laughed then. She had thought that was his gift, and that it was what he brought to their partnership. Then the money came, and money changed the order of everything. First came the photographs. They were taken for magazines, and Sloane was asked to stand a little farther back, then a little farther still, and the next time, she wasn't invited at all. Someone from the communications team explained to her in a very gentle voice that she didn't fit the brand image. She asked about it once, only once, and Weston told her that people needed one face, not 2. Then Camille came back. She entered the conference room under the title of communications consultant. Her hair cut differently, her walk changed, even the name on her badge altered by a single letter. Sloane was pouring water when she looked up. The two of them stared at each other across the length of the long table for no more than a few seconds. Neither nodded, neither spoke. In those few seconds, Sloane understood everything. She understood that Camille knew exactly who she was, knew exactly what had happened that summer, and knew that the only person in the world who had ever looked at her as a thief was standing right there, holding a pitcher of water. Camille smiled at the room and took her seat. Sloane set the pitcher on the table, and the lid made a sound softer than usual. In the shelter kitchen, her 2 hands folded the dough one final time, then covered it with a cloth. The peak season arrived earlier than it had in any previous year, and Sloane still took the night shift, still worked the ovens, still remained the last person to turn off the kitchen lights. She was pregnant. She told Weston one morning between 2 meetings, and he embraced her. smiled, said it was the best news of the year, then looked at his watch and left. After that, they didn't speak of it very often. The people in the kitchen knew. Some began carrying the heavier trays for her without being asked, while others pulled a chair closer to where she worked in case she wanted to sit down. And Sloane thanked every one of them and continued standing. She told them the peak season would last only a few weeks, that she would rest once it was over, that if she left the kitchen now, the entire operation would fall apart. She believed it. She had built that operation with her own hands, so she knew exactly where it was weak. Weston went to Miami that week with the communications team to film a series of features about his culinary inspirations. On the 4th night of that week, the kitchen was running at full capacity. The order bell rang without pause, and Sloane was standing at the head of the line when she placed one hand against the edge of the steel counter. She collapsed in the kitchen. A few days later, Weston came in carrying a bouquet of flowers. He set it down, sat on the edge of the bed, took her hand, and said he was sorry, but she knew it was peak season. Sloane didn't answer. She looked at the flowers, then out the window, and remained silent for the rest of that afternoon. She remained silent throughout the following week. She never spoke a word to anyone about what had happened. Not then, not many years later, and that silence closed like a door she would never open again. She returned to the kitchen sooner than anyone thought was reasonable. The sous chef in charge of the morning shift tried to stop her, told her she should stay home longer, and Sloane only shook her head, tied on her apron, and asked what was on the schedule that day. The life of the restaurant continued flowing forward, and within that current, 2 small decisions were made that almost no one paid attention to at the time. The first decision concerned the seafood supplier. The old company had delivered to them since the earliest days, and its prices were higher than the market average. But the shipments arrived on time. Every crate was kept at the proper temperature, and the delivery man was an older man who always opened each lid for Sloane to inspect before she signed for anything. Weston ended that contract during a meeting that lasted less than half a day. He presented a price comparison, pointed to the final figure, and said there was no reason to pay extra for a name. Sloane asked whether he had visited the new supplier's warehouse. He said someone else had already gone. The second decision seemed even smaller. The main kitchen's cold storage room had a temperature alarm, and its threshold was set rather tightly. So during peak service, when the door was opening and closing constantly, it sounded. It was shrill, persistent, and loud enough to reach the dining room. Customers had complained. Someone had written online that it ruined the atmosphere. As Weston passed the kitchen manager one day, he gave a single instruction, telling him to turn off the alarm during service and switch it back on after closing. The manager nodded. No one recorded it in the meeting notes, because it wasn't the kind of thing people recorded in meeting notes. Sloane learned about it the following day. She found Weston in his office and told him the alarm wasn't there for decoration, that it was the only thing that would warn them before something had time to go wrong, and that if the noise was the problem, they should replace the alarm rather than turn it off. She spoke calmly and never raised her voice, because she had learned that raising her voice with him had never accomplished anything. Weston listened to every word. He waited until she had finished, rolled his pen once across the surface of the desk, then looked up and asked whether she remembered whose name was written on the sign outside the door. The question wasn't loud. It wasn't angry either. It was simply placed between them like something heavy, and Sloane understood that the conversation had ended before she ever entered the room. She walked out, closed the door gently behind her, and returned to the kitchen. The peak season continued for several more weeks. That night began like every other weekend night, crowded with reservations, filled with the ringing of order bells and the clatter of pans, until the first server stepped into the kitchen and said that one table needed an ambulance, then a second table, then a third. In less than an hour, emergency vehicles filled the entire stretch of street outside. 31 diners were carried away, and the dining room went from noise to a kind of silence Sloane would never later be able to describe to anyone. She didn't panic. That was the strangest part, and it was also what people would later use against her. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and began giving orders, one sentence at a time, brief and clear, as though some part of her had been rehearsing for that moment for 20 years without her ever knowing it. She shut down the entire line. She had the dining room doors sealed. She told the sous chef to take the table list and record exactly which dishes had left the kitchen and at what time. Then she went straight down to the cold storage room. She opened the door, looked inside, and understood in less time than it took to draw a breath. She ordered the entire shipment destroyed. Nothing kept. Not a single crate spared. She ordered the storage room scrubbed and disinfected that very night. Thoroughly. Completely. Until not 1 millimeter of surface remained untreated, because the next day that kitchen would still have to open for other people. Someone asked whether they should wait until morning. She said they couldn't wait. The kitchen crew worked through the night. Sloane worked beside them, her hands gloved, her hair tied back, and by the time dawn began to break, the cold room was clean enough to reflect the lights. She didn't go home. She sat on the back steps, removed her gloves, and for the first time in many hours allowed her hands to stretch open. Weston returned close to noon. He came with 2 men in suits whom Sloane had never seen before, and they went straight into the office and closed the door. Sloane wasn't called in. That afternoon, when she picked up the storage log to compare the delivery times, she saw that the page wasn't the same one she had signed the day before. The handwriting was still the same. The temperature column was still filled in. Only a few numbers had changed just enough to make the story flow in another direction. And the person who knew most clearly that they had changed was the one holding the book. She took it to Weston. He looked at the log, then at her, and said that perhaps she was tired, that everyone had been tired the night before, and that someone else would handle it. The health inspector arrived the following day. His name was Douglas Reiner. His hair was salt and pepper, and he carried a briefcase worn at the corners. He moved through the kitchen very slowly and asked very few questions. He asked Sloane about the cold storage room. She told him exactly what she had done. He nodded, wrote it down, then asked one more question, one she wouldn't understand until many years later, asking what had been preserved. She answered that nothing had been preserved. He asked no more. He signed the final report at the end of that week, and that report became the foundation for everything that followed. Then the television crews came, and the cameras needed only one face to point toward, and that face had been carefully rehearsed for years. The rest moved quickly, so quickly that Sloane couldn't remember the order. Lawsuits, investigations, meetings that dragged on inside windowless rooms, and finally, after one long season, the criminal case ended with full words printed on the documents. Dismissed for insufficient evidence. Someone called to give her the news as though it were good news, and Sloane sat holding the phone long after the person on the other end had hung up. Those 4 words didn't say she was innocent. They only said that no one had found enough to charge her, and between those 2 things lay a space as wide as the rest of her life. The whole country read those 4 words. Not one person read them in a way that helped her. The divorce papers were signed one morning at the courthouse, and everything happened faster than Sloane had expected, because by then she had nothing left to dispute. She stepped into the hallway first, and Weston followed behind her, carrying his coat, looking like a man calculating whether he could still make his afternoon meeting. He called her name. She stopped. He said he knew what she was thinking, that she believed she had been wronged, and that he wanted to tell her one thing before the 2 of them no longer had any reason to speak to each other. He said, "You weren't wronged. You were simply the price that had to be paid. Every company has a price it must pay in exchange for something greater." Then he put on his coat and walked toward the elevator. Sloane remained in that hallway for a while longer, still holding the stack of papers she hadn't yet put into her bag. That winter, she lived in her old car, parked in the lot behind a supermarket, where the lights stayed on all night and the restrooms opened at 6 o'clock. She washed her face there, folded her blanket every morning, and kept the inside of the car clean. By the end of the season, she sold the car too, bought a ticket for an overnight bus, and left Philadelphia carrying 1 cloth bag. Savannah was a city with a slower rhythm, with tree-shaded streets and old iron gates, and no one there knew who she was. She found work washing dishes at a late-night diner, from 10 o'clock at night until 3 o'clock in the morning, paid in cash, with no questions asked about paperwork. The owner only needed to know that she worked quickly and didn't break anything. During the day, she slept for a few hours in a small rented room on the 2nd floor of an old house, then woke and walked to the morning prayer shelter. She went there the first time only to ask for a meal, and Yvonne Prescott, after watching her stand in line, asked whether she knew how to use an oven. Sloane said she did. From that day on, she cooked there without pay, without a contract, without her name appearing on any list. No one was allowed to hire her as a head chef anymore, but there was no law preventing a person from cooking for free for people who had nowhere else to eat. She cooked for them the way she had once cooked for dining rooms filled with paying customers, with the same care, the same way of seasoning, the same way of arranging each plate. Someone noticed and told her so. She only smiled and said food didn't know who was eating it. The first months passed according to that rhythm, washing dishes at night, standing over the stove by day, and little by little, she began to sleep a little more. Then she noticed the man who came on Thursdays. He first appeared one morning early in some week she couldn't remember clearly, and all she recalled was that he came through the back door, nodded to Yvonne, then fetched a low stool for himself, and sat in the corner of the kitchen beside the bin of potatoes. He didn't ask what needed to be done. He picked up a knife and began peeling, slowly and steadily, one potato after another, throughout the entire morning. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't eat. At noon, he stood, washed the knife, returned the stool to the exact place where he had found it, and left. Sloane assumed he was someone going through hard times, like so many people who passed through that kitchen, except that he had chosen to repay kindness before receiving any. She didn't ask. In that place, people didn't ask. But on the third or perhaps the fourth time he came, when she passed him and looked down into his basket of potatoes, she stopped. The peels were all evenly thin, without a single place where the blade had cut too deeply into the flesh, and yet the basket was far less empty than it should have been for the length of time he had been sitting there. She said, "You peel too slowly." The man didn't look up at once. He finished peeling the potato in his hand, set it down, then looked at her and said, "I'm not in a hurry. This is the only morning of the week when no one is waiting for me to make a decision." Then he picked up the next potato. Sloane stood there for one more moment, then turned back toward her kitchen. The warehouse stood at the edge of the harbor, and inside there was only a long table set in the middle of the bare concrete floor, a single light hanging above it, and his men standing along the walls, none of them speaking. Cassian Barone entered last and took the seat at the head of the table, the chair facing the door. He always sat there, in every room, and no one in the family had ever asked why. The man seated at the opposite end was named Emmett Dowd. He had worked for the family since before Cassian took control. Since the days when Cassian's father still occupied that chair, Dowd had taken money. No one needed to say the amount aloud, because everyone in the room already knew, and because Cassian didn't care about the amount. He didn't ask why either. That was the first thing that made Dowd begin to tremble, the fact that no one asked him, because for several nights he had prepared his answer, and now there was nowhere left to place it. Cassian opened the file case, removed the first document, and pushed it across the table. It was a stack of hospital bills for Dowd's mother, accumulated over many years, each one paid under a name that wasn't Dowd's. He waited until Dowd had finished looking, then pushed the second document forward. The papers for the house, also spanning years, also bearing the same name behind them. Then came the third, and the third was a photograph of Dowd's daughter on the day she graduated from college, standing in the courtyard, holding her diploma, smiling. Cassian pushed the photograph more slowly than the first two documents. It slid across the tabletop and came to rest directly before Dowd's hands. There was no sound inside the warehouse except the water striking the harbor wall outside. Then Cassian spoke. He said, "Keep the money." He said, "From today on, you pay for everything on this table yourself." Then he said the final words. "One day you'll understand how lightly you've been allowed to live all this time." He didn't raise his voice on a single word. Dowd looked up. He looked at the photograph, then at Cassian, and he began to speak, saying he would pay it back, that he would repay twice the amount, that this was the only work he had ever known, and that outside this place, he didn't know where else to go. No one in the room moved. Dowd left his chair and dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, both hands gripping the edge of the table, and he begged to be allowed to stay. Begged in the voice of a man who had grown too old to beg for anything. Cassian looked at him. He didn't turn away, didn't show discomfort, and didn't show pity. He simply looked, and the silence lasted long enough for everyone in the room to understand that the answer wouldn't change. Then Cassian removed the watch from his wrist and placed it on the table. The sound of metal touching wood was very soft, but everyone standing along the walls heard it, and everyone who heard it knew the matter was finished. He stood. He walked around the table, not stepping over the place where Dowd knelt but going around him, then reached the door, and he didn't look back once. His assistant followed him outside, waiting until they were standing beneath the night sky before asking whether anyone should be assigned to watch Dowd. Cassian looked out across the water. He said no. Then he added, "Let him live. Death would be too quick." The assistant asked nothing more. Behind them, inside the warehouse, The others began leaving one by one. And as always, the last person to leave that room was Cassian, after he had turned off the light. 3 nights later, it was a Wednesday. He returned home late, sat for a long time in his study with the files before him without opening a single page, and near dawn he went upstairs. The following morning was Thursday. He rose early, drove himself, brought no one with him, and passed through the still quiet streets of Savannah until he reached the end of a peaceful road where there stood a shelter called Morning Prayer. He entered through the back door, nodded to the woman standing at the sink, pulled a low stool from the corner of the kitchen, sat beside the bin of potatoes, and picked up a knife. After that brief conversation beside the basket of potatoes, Sloane began setting aside a meal for him. She didn't ask first, and didn't say anything. She simply prepared a separate plate while serving lunch to everyone else, covered it, placed it on the table near where he sat, then turned away to do something else. That afternoon, while emptying the kitchen trash, she found her plate. The food was untouched, not a single bite taken, and the plate had merely been turned upside down to keep things tidy. She stood looking at it for a while, then tied the trash bag shut. The following Thursday, she left another plate. Again, she found it in the trash. She didn't ask. She wasn't angry either. People came to that place for all kinds of reasons. No one had the right to demand an explanation for. And she had lived long enough to understand that some people refused a meal, not because they thought poorly of it, so she left another the next week. Then again the week after that. He still arrived every Thursday morning, still pulled the low stool from the corner, still peeled one potato after another, at the pace of a man with nothing chasing him, and still didn't eat. Yvonne had noticed long before, but she said nothing. Only once, as she passed Sloane covering the plate, did she let out a very quiet breath. By the 14th week, Sloane did something different. That day, she made a simple stew, the kind Odette used to cook when the weather turned, and once the kitchen had emptied, she filled 2 plates instead of 1. She carried both to the corner of the kitchen. She placed one before him as she always did, then set the second across from it, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He looked up. Sloane didn't look at him. She picked up her fork, took a bite from her own plate, and ate. Then she took a second bite. She ate slowly, without speaking, her eyes lowered to the table, as though she and her lunch were the only things in the kitchen. He didn't move. He sat there with the knife still in his hand, watching her for a very long time, long enough that anyone else in the kitchen would have found it strange. Sloane took a third bite, then she set down her fork, raised her eyes, and looked directly at him for the first time since sitting down. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. After a while, he placed the knife on the edge of the basket, wiped his hands on the towel hanging nearby, pulled the plate closer, and picked up the fork. He ate everything, not quickly, not slowly, and without offering a single comment about the food. When he finished, he stood, carried the plate to the sink, washed it himself, then set it upside down on the rack. Sloane remained where she was. She watched his back as he walked out through the rear door, and she sat there for a long while after it had closed. From that day on, he ate every Thursday. It became part of the morning, like the crackling of the oven or the sound of a broom sweeping the porch, and no one at the shelter thought there was anything worth discussing. Then one day, while Yvonne struggled with a stack of paperwork at the small table in the hallway, she grumbled about having to complete the quarterly funding report, and called out that at least only one organization had supported the place all these years, which made the paperwork less complicated. Sloane asked which one. Without looking up, Yvonne answered that it was Barone Group, that it had been funding the shelter long before Sloane ever arrived, and that for the past several years, the person signing the checks had been the same man who sat there peeling potatoes. Sloane was holding a stack of plates. She set them down on the table very gently, then walked out to the porch and stood there. She had heard that name in Savannah. She had heard it at the late-night diner where she washed dishes, heard the way the men at the last table lowered their voices when they spoke it, and heard the brief silence that followed. She wasn't curious. She was afraid. She had already been destroyed once for standing beside the wrong person, and she didn't have the strength to do it again. That afternoon, she told Yvonne that perhaps she should leave. Yvonne hadn't yet answered when he appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coat in his hand, and he said, "You know what I do now, so be afraid. I don't blame you, but I'll still be here next Thursday." Sloane didn't leave. She stayed, and several weeks later, she accepted when he invited her to dinner, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she wanted to see with her own eyes the things she feared. The restaurant stood on a narrow street, with a heavy wooden door, warm golden light inside, and voices kept at just the right volume. The manager recognized him before he had even entered and came out to greet him, and Sloane noticed that both of the man's hands trembled as he pulled out the chair. He addressed Cassian by a title she had never heard anyone use for a living man, then stepped back half a pace, only to move forward again and ask whether they would prefer a quieter table. Cassian said this table was fine. The meal passed normally for a while, until a man at the table behind them began raising his voice at his wife. At first, he wasn't very loud, but his voice grew louder, while the woman sitting across from him only lowered her eyes to her plate. Sloane turned to look. Cassian didn't. He remained in the same position, facing the door as he always did, and he did only one thing. He folded the napkin that had been resting on his lap and placed it at the edge of the table. No one called anyone. No one approached his table. A few minutes later, 2 men in coats appeared beside the table behind them, said something very brief, and the other man rose, his face drained of color, allowing them to escort him outside. The manager went to the woman's table and told her that the bill had been paid and that a car was waiting outside if she wished to go home alone. No one raised their voice. No one touched anyone. Sloane later learned that from that evening on, the man could no longer reserve a table at any restaurant in the city, and no ban had ever been issued. Every place was simply full. She sat there with her hands still resting on the table, and understood something that sent a chill along her spine. The man sitting across from her didn't even need to give an order. He only had to change his posture. She asked whether he was ever afraid of himself. Cassian looked at her for a while, then said, "Every day, and that's why I only go there on Thursdays." Then he continued, and it was the first time he had ever said more than 3 sentences to her at once. He told her that many years earlier, his father had died in the family kitchen, in the middle of dinner, and Cassian had been there. That was all he said about what had happened. He didn't add another word. Then he spoke about what came afterward. He said that very night, he had taken that chair, and by morning, he had become the man who had to decide everything, even though he had never wanted the chair and no one had ever asked whether he did. He said that for many years afterward, he couldn't eat anything unless he had prepared part of it with his own hands. It wasn't because he believed someone was waiting for him somewhere. It was simply that whenever he lifted a fork, his hand stopped, and he couldn't overcome that moment of hesitation. He had tried. He tried at home, tried in restaurants, tried with people he knew, and every time it was the same, so he stopped trying. He told her this in the voice of a man reporting the weather, and Sloane sat in silence while one image after another rose in her mind. The plates she had covered and set on the table near where he sat, the plates she had lifted from the trash without saying a word, week after week, and she understood that through all that time, he hadn't looked down on her food for even a second. She asked why he had eaten that week. Cassian was silent for a long while. Then he said, "Because you sat down first." On the way out to the car, his lawyer was waiting at the curb with a stack of papers that needed to be signed immediately. A middle-aged man named Beckett Moss, and while he waited for Cassian to sign them, Beckett glanced toward the restaurant and said to Sloane, as though explaining a household rule to someone new, that the Barone family never threatened anyone. The Barone family only gave one warning. The invitation came on a Thursday morning, and it didn't come from Cassian, but from his grandmother. She sent word through him that she wanted someone to cook with her that Sunday, and that she was old now and didn't like repeating an invitation twice. Sloane went. The house stood hidden behind a row of trees, older than she had imagined, and the woman who opened the door was a small, stooped old lady named Rosaria Barone. She didn't ask what Sloane did for a living, didn't ask where she had come from, didn't ask any of the things people usually asked when meeting someone for the first time. She simply led her into the kitchen, pointed to the sink in the corner, then stepped back and watched. Sloane rolled up her sleeves, turned on the faucet, and washed her hands the way Odette had taught her when she was 15, cleaning carefully beneath every nail, then drying them completely before touching anything. When she turned around, Rosaria was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. The old woman opened the lowest drawer of the cupboard, took out a thick, leather-bound notebook faded with age, its paper edges worn and frayed, then placed it on the table in front of Sloane. She said it was the book of this family, and before that day it had never rested in the hands of anyone who didn't bear the name Barone. Sloane said she couldn't accept it. She said perhaps Rosaria didn't know everything about her, that if she searched Sloane's name, she would find a great deal to read, and she said it while looking down at the table. Rosaria pulled out a chair and sat, letting out the breath of someone whose hip no longer served her well, then said that her grandson had told her enough. But she had no need to know what the newspapers had written. She only needed to see how a person washed her hands before entering a kitchen. Then she pushed the notebook a little farther towards Sloane and told her to turn to the page marked by an oil stain, because that was the dish she made worst. That afternoon stretched on until evening. Cassian came home near dusk and stood in the doorway watching the two women in the kitchen, and neither of them turned to greet him. They were married at the end of the following spring, in the backyard of that house beneath trees that had grown full with leaves. Rosaria was there, Beckett Moss was there, Yvonne was there, and several members of the family were there, all of them together filling exactly 2 rows of chairs. There were no photographs, no announcement, not a single line printed anywhere. Sloane changed nothing. She still drove her old car, still woke before 4 o'clock, still went to the shelter every morning and baked bread for the people waiting in line outside on the porch. Cassian asked her once, only once, whether she wanted to stop working there, and she answered that it was the only place in the world where people needed her for exactly what she knew how to do. He never asked again. She refused everything else, too. Refused a driver, refused evenings filled with cameras, even refused to use her new name on any document where it wasn't legally required. In Savannah, people knew who Mrs. Barone was, but no one spoke of it, because that was the family's business. In Philadelphia, no one knew at all. The name Sloane Merrick remained fixed in people's memories in the form of the 4 words printed on those papers long ago, and in that memory, she was still somewhere far away, ruined and finished. 2 years passed that way. Then, at the beginning of that summer, the Marchmont Hotel in downtown Savannah began hanging banners welcoming the Southern Hospitality and Culinary Investment Conference, an annual gathering lasting several days, and bringing together most of the significant names in the industry along the East Coast. The hotel belonged to Barone Group. On that year's list was a restaurant chain from Philadelphia being offered for sale to an investment fund. And according to the published schedule, the conference was only where the 2 sides would meet, while the official signing ceremony would take place at that same hotel at the end of the season. Weston Ashcroft arrived in Savannah on the first day of the conference and stayed at the Marchmont, in a room high above the city with a view of the river, never once realizing who owned the building where he slept. He was there to offer his restaurant chain for sale to an investment fund, and during the first 2 days, everything unfolded exactly as he had hoped. People shook his hand. People remembered his name. Someone even mentioned an old interview he had given on camera, the one he often used to open every meeting. On the evening before the final day, he went down to the ground floor looking for somewhere to smoke, and accidentally entered the service corridor, a narrow passage leading to the rear entrance where deliveries were received every morning and every evening. He was about to turn back when he heard laughter. At the far end of the corridor, the back door stood open, and a woman was there with several trays of bread stacked on a cart. The hotel's head chef came outside and embraced her, the kind of embrace shared by people who had known each other for a long time, then called someone from the kitchen to come see that day's batch. 4 or 5 people stepped out. They greeted her by name. A young kitchen assistant handed her a cup of something hot, and she accepted it with both hands. Weston stood motionless in the darkness of the corridor. He remained there for several minutes. The woman wore a faded shirt, her hair tied neatly behind her head, and when she bent to inspect the lowest tray, he saw her hands, and he didn't need to see anything else. She pushed the empty cart outside, the door closed, and laughter continued drifting from the kitchen for a while. He returned to his room and didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the darkness, and the thought circling through his mind wasn't that she was still alive, but why people had welcomed her that way. He had spent so much effort burying that name. He had stood before cameras, chosen every word, allowed his voice to break at exactly the right moment, and the entire country had believed him. Yet at the end of a service corridor, in the very hotel where he was staying, that woman had been welcomed by an entire 5-star kitchen, as though she belonged there. Near dawn, he went down to the lobby and asked the receptionist what time the breakfast bread was delivered and where it came from. She answered, then smiled and added that the bread at the Marchmont was the best in the city. Weston thanked her. He called Camille and woke her, told her to get dressed, then brought the car around and drove toward Bull Street. That evening, after they had both returned to their rooms, Camille opened the recording they had made from the car and watched it once more. She had no intention of posting it anywhere public. She opened a private industry chat group, The one with more than 10 people who often shared news and things that were never meant to be said aloud, and typed a cruel line about stains that could never be washed clean. Her finger lingered above the screen longer than necessary, and in that moment, there was a diner door opening at 4 o'clock in the morning, and a woman pushing a plate of warm bread toward her without asking where she had come from. Then she pressed send. There was someone in that group who had once worked as a sous chef under Sloane many years earlier. Someone Camille had forgotten was there. He watched the recording 3 times, captured the screen, and released it publicly. The footage spread through the night, and by morning it was everywhere. But it didn't spread in the direction Camille had imagined. People didn't laugh. They asked who the woman was. They asked why she was picking the bread up. They counted the loaves scattered across the concrete and calculated for themselves how early someone would have needed to wake to bake that many. By noon, Weston's name appeared beneath the recording, and by afternoon, people had begun digging up the things he had said on camera 3 years earlier, placing the two side by side without adding any comment. In New Jersey, inside a room many hours by car from Savannah, a man watched the recording for the 4th time, paused at the frame showing the woman's face, then told the person beside him to print it. His family had spent years searching for an opening in the Barone family. Cassian watched the recording for the first time at around 10 o'clock that night, in his study, after his assistant sent it to him with exactly 1 line of text. He watched it all the way through without skipping or pausing. Then he watched it a 2nd time, then a 3rd. After the 3rd viewing, he placed the device face down on the desk and sat in silence. The house was very quiet then, with only the steady hum of the heating system's fan somewhere behind the walls. He didn't stand. He didn't strike anything. He simply sat there with both hands resting on the desk, and anyone who entered at that moment might have thought he was waiting for a call. Beckett Moss arrived before midnight, still wearing the clothes he had worn to dinner, his tie tucked into his coat pocket. He had watched the recording on the way there. He set down his briefcase, pulled out a chair, and didn't speak first. Cassian was the one who spoke. He said the man had a flight the following morning, and he said, "I don't want him getting on it." He used the same voice he used when asking whether the day's shipment had arrived on time. Beckett nodded once, took his phone from the inside pocket of his coat, unlocked it, and began searching for a number. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Sloane stood there with one hand on the banister, and she had been standing there long enough to hear everything. She didn't ask what was happening. She came all the way down the stairs, walked past where her husband sat, went to Beckett's side, and placed her hand over the phone in his grasp. Beckett stopped. He looked toward Cassian. No one spoke for several seconds. Sloane didn't look at Beckett. She turned toward her husband and said in an ordinary voice, low and clear on every word, that if he did this, then tomorrow morning all of America would still believe she had poisoned 31 people. She said she would merely become the wife of a criminal instead of being the criminal herself. And to the people who had read those 4 words on the papers that day, the 2 things were the same. She said she didn't need the man to disappear. She needed him to open his mouth. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice at any point. She didn't remove her hand from the phone either. Cassian looked at her. He looked for a very long time. Long enough that Beckett began to feel the weight of the phone in his hand, and within that silence, many things passed through the room without being spoken. There was a warehouse at the harbor. There was a man kneeling on a concrete floor, begging to be allowed to stay. There was a dining table in the family kitchen many years before, and a son who had never wanted the chair at its head. Cassian had spent his entire life in a world where the only thing keeping everything upright was the certainty that once an order had been given, it couldn't be withdrawn, because the day people began to believe his commands could be negotiated was the day he would no longer be able to hold anyone in place. He understood that better than anyone in that house. He also knew that if he did as his wife asked, the 2 men waiting at the other end of the line would remember it for a very long time. The silence continued. Sloane didn't move her hand. At last, Cassian said one word to Beckett. "Cancel it." Beckett lowered the phone, locked the screen, and returned it to the inside pocket of his coat. He asked nothing more. He picked up his briefcase, nodded to both of them, then went out the door, and the sound of his car gradually faded along the road. Only the 2 of them remained in the room. Cassian rose from his chair. He said no one had ever made him reverse an order before. He didn't say it as an accusation or a warning, but simply as a man recording something that had happened for the first time. Sloane looked at him and said, "Then let me be the first. He didn't answer. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the dark yard. And when he turned back, he asked her only one question. Where do you want to begin? The following morning, Sloane still went to the shelter as she did every day, because she hadn't yet found an answer to her husband's question, and because there was always work to be done in a kitchen. Close to 9 o'clock, someone from the health department arrived for a routine inspection, something that happened several times a year, and Yvonne met her at the front door with the paperwork already prepared. The woman who entered the kitchen appeared to be in her late 30s, her hair tied low, carrying an inspection file and a tray of sampling tools in her arms. She read the duty roster posted on the wall, wrote down a few words, then looked up toward the oven. Sloane was opening the oven door to turn the trays of bread. The tray in the woman's hands fell onto the tiled floor. The sound made everyone in the kitchen turn around. She stood there with all the color drained from her face, her eyes fixed on Sloane, and the first thing that burst from her lips was a name, first and last, the name no one in that city had used for Sloane in 3 years. Yvonne reacted before she even understood what was happening. She turned to Delaney and told her to take the basket out to the porch and count the portions for her right now, using a voice that allowed no questions. Delaney looked around in confusion, then picked up the basket and went outside. The moment the door closed, the woman began speaking loudly. She said her name was Priya Vance, and she asked whether the people standing in that kitchen knew who they were cooking beside. She said that woman had killed her father. No one in the kitchen moved. Someone turned toward Sloane, waiting for her to say something. Just one thing. Sloane said nothing. Priya stepped 2 paces closer, both hands trembling, and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence. She asked, "Do you know what my father did for a living?" Then she answered her own question, saying that he had taught his entire life, that he had taught history, that he had continued teaching until the final year before his retirement, that he had never once made anyone wait for him, not a student, not a colleague, not even the newspaper vendor at the end of the street. She said he had only gone out to dinner to celebrate his birthday. She said no more than that, then stopped because she couldn't continue. Sloane remained still. She looked at the woman standing before her, and there wasn't a single word of defense in her mind, not because she couldn't think of one, but because for 3 years she had lived with one unchanging thought, that no matter which records had been altered, no matter what those 4 words on the papers had said, a man had still eaten food that came from the kitchen she had been responsible for, and after that meal, he had never gone home again. That thought needed no evidence. It was already inside her every morning when she opened the oven, and it was the reason she had never knocked on anyone's door to demand her name back. She reached behind herself, untied her apron, folded it, and placed it on the table. She told Yvonne that the bread trays needed to come out in 10 minutes. Then she walked through the back door. No one called after her. Outside, the sun had already climbed high. Delaney was sitting on the porch steps with the basket in her lap, looking up as though she were about to ask something, and Sloane only placed a hand on the girl's shoulder as she passed. She reached the parking area, opened the car door, sat behind the wheel, and closed the door. She didn't start the engine. She sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, and she remained that way for a very long time. The car was unbearably hot. She didn't lower the windows. Eventually, the phone in her pocket began to vibrate. She took it out and looked at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number with a Philadelphia area code. She didn't answer. It rang until the call ended. That afternoon, it rang again. That night, it rang several more times, the last call coming very late, and she let it ring until it stopped on its own. Priya Vance arrived home after dark, and she ate nothing. She went straight into the back room and pulled the cardboard box from beneath the cabinet, the box she had left untouched in that same place since the day she moved in. She did this with a very clear purpose. She wanted to find something more. A name, a point in time, a single line that would allow her to go to the department the following morning and demand that someone reconsider who was being permitted to work in the kitchen of a facility receiving public funding. She wanted enough paperwork that no one could dismiss her. She took out each item one by one and arranged them in rows across the floor. The lawyer's summary, 4 pages long, nearly every line of which she knew by heart, the correspondence, the copy of the lawsuit, and at the very bottom, a large brown envelope, still sealed, its upper edge never cut open. It was the complete case file. As a family member, she had always been entitled to receive it, and it had been sent to her very early on. She had carried it home and placed it beneath the cabinet. For 3 years, every time she moved, she had taken it with her to the next place, each time telling herself she would open it another day, and each time the thought of doing so made her feel as though someone were closing a hand around her chest. There are things people don't read not because they lack the right, but because they lack the strength. That night, she sat down on the floor, rested the envelope across her lap, and cut it open. She read slowly. She read one page after another, and there were places she had to read twice because her eyes had passed over the words without her mind taking them in. Then she reached the page containing the final conclusion. She read it once and didn't understand. She read it a second time, tracing each line with her finger. It stated that her father had been discharged from the hospital, had returned home, had recovered, and had died several weeks later from a heart condition, and the final line clearly stated that there was no connection between the two events. Unrelated. Priya sat completely still for a very long time with the paper in her hand. She read it a third time, then she placed it carefully on the floor, as though it might break, and straightened her back, both hands resting on her knees. The house was silent. For 3 years, every morning when she woke, she had possessed a place where she could set down her pain. She had a name. She had a face from the news to look at whenever missing her father became unbearable, and that face had kept her standing. No one had ever told her this, but she knew. She knew that anger had carried her to work each day, had helped her sit through every meeting, had kept her from falling. And now it was no longer there. That place was empty. Her father was still gone, and there was no one left for her to hate. He had simply passed away one afternoon, at home, because his heart had reached the end of its journey, and no one had caused it. Priya began to cry, and she cried in the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry 3 years earlier, because 3 years earlier she had been too busy searching for someone to hold responsible. She grieved for her father all over again, from the very beginning. She sat on the floor among the papers spread around her, and she remained there throughout the night. Dawn began to lighten the sky close to 4 o'clock. She stood, washed her face, gathered all the papers and returned them to the envelope, then drove away. The streets were still empty. The back entrance of the morning prayer shelter was lit, and Priya pushed open the door and stepped inside. There, alone in the kitchen, Sloane was kneading dough. No one knew how long she had been there, her apron tied around her as it was every day. Both hands sunk into the mass of dough, and she didn't turn when she heard the door. Priya walked to the kitchen table. She placed the envelope on the surface beside the flour and said, "I came to give you back 3 years." Sloane's hands stopped. She looked down at the envelope, then raised her eyes. The two women looked at each other across the width of that kitchen table. Then Priya walked around it, and Sloane held out both hands, still covered in dough, and they embraced there, amid the scent of yeast and flour, and they both wept, neither of them saying another word until the first batch of bread that morning was already late going into the oven. Priya began working on it the very next day, and she did so using the exact tools of her profession. She searched old public service directories, examined personnel records that had since been released, called 2 people who had once worked in the same department, and by the end of the week, she had a name and an address in a small town, a little more than an hour's drive from Philadelphia. Douglas Reiner had retired long ago. The 2 women went there one morning and parked in front of a 1-story house with a wooden fence whose paint had faded. Sloane knocked on the door. The man who opened it was thin and old, his hair completely white, and he looked at her for exactly 1 second before one hand gripped the doorframe. Sloane hadn't even had time to say her name. He spoke first, saying, "I've been waiting for you for more than 3 years. Afraid you would die before you came." The house was dark and orderly, carrying the smell of medicine, with an armchair positioned close to the window. He poured water for them with trembling hands, then went into the back room and returned carrying a shoebox. He placed it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were newspaper clippings, stacked one upon another, all of them yellowed with age. Front pages, inside pages, short reports tucked into corners, long interviews. There were even pieces that mentioned her name in only a single line. He had cut out every one of them through all those years, and he had used scissors instead of tearing them, so every edge was straight. Sloane picked up the clipping on top, then set it down again. Reiner sat in the chair across from her and began to speak, slowly and without evasion. He told them that his wife had been in the hospital at the time, that he had signed the report because he had told himself he was only signing a piece of paper, that the storage log had been replaced before he arrived, and he had known it, had known from the second page. because the ink hadn't aged the same way as the ink on the pages before it. He said, "I once thought I was selling a signature. It turned out I was selling an entire human life, and it wasn't even my own." After saying that, he fell silent for a long time, both hands resting on his knees. He said that from that day until now, he hadn't stepped inside a bakery. Priya asked whether he had kept anything at all. A copy, a note, a rough draft. Reiner shook his head. He said the original log had been replaced, while the report bore his own signature, and apart from the word of a retired old man, he had nothing left to place on the table. He said his testimony might make people suspicious, but suspicion couldn't overturn anything. They needed something they could hold in their hands. Then he asked Sloane, in the same voice he had used in the kitchen that day, what had been preserved that night. Sloane was about to answer as she always had. Then she stopped. She sat in silence and saw that cold storage room again, its door open, the chill spilling outward, and she heard her own voice giving orders, one sentence at a time, brief and clear. Destroy the entire shipment. Keep nothing. Scrub and disinfect the room that very night. Do it thoroughly. Do all of it. She remembered someone asking whether they should wait until morning. She remembered saying they couldn't wait. She remembered that by dawn, the room had been clean enough to reflect the lights, and she had sat on the back steps, removed her gloves, and for one moment felt relieved because she believed she had done the right thing. Sloane set her glass of water on the table. She straightened in her chair, her eyes fixed on the shoebox, and said, "For 3 years, I've kept asking why no one would open the door for me, when all along I was the one who locked it." No one spoke after that. Priya looked at her, then lowered her eyes. Reiner said nothing either. He only reached out and closed the lid of the shoebox. The two women left when the sun was directly overhead. Reiner walked them as far as the front steps, standing there with one hand braced against the door. And when Sloane had reached the bottom step, he called after her. He said someone had come there before she did. Sloane turned around. He said, "He asked whether I had kept anything, and I told him no." Then he closed the door. When she returned home, Sloane pulled out the box of old papers she had brought with her from Philadelphia and hadn't opened once since moving there. She searched for copies of the reports, searched for documents bearing Reiner's signature, searched for anything that might fit into the empty space the old man had pointed out. She went through every file, setting aside anything that might be useful, and near the bottom of the box, tucked between 2 unrelated bills, she found a small piece of paper she had completely forgotten she still possessed. It was a copy of the check that had paid her legal fees back then. She had had no money. During the very week when the law office called to say they would stop working unless the remaining balance was paid, someone called again and told her that a legal aid fund had agreed to cover the cost. She had asked for the name of the fund. They told her the people behind it wished to remain anonymous. For 3 years, whenever she remembered it, she had thought of it as an act of kindness from somewhere far away, one of those accidents of life she would never be able to repay. Now she held the copy beneath the desk lamp, and in the lower right corner was a signature, Rosaria Barone. Sloane sat there for a very long time. For the first several minutes, she couldn't think of anything at all. Her mind was empty, filled only with the sound of the clock in the other room. Then everything began arranging itself, and it happened quickly, more quickly than she wanted. The shelter where Yvonne had asked whether she knew how to use an oven. The man who came through the back door one Thursday morning, fetched his own stool, picked up his own knife, and never asked anyone what needed to be done. He sat there all morning, week after week, while she believed he was someone going through hard times like so many others who passed through that kitchen. She remembered setting aside a meal for him, remembered lifting it from the trash, remembered leaving another, and remembered believing that she had been the one who began it all. She sat there and felt that thought close inside her chest like a door. Cassian returned late that night. He found her sitting at the table with the box of papers open before her and the small piece of paper lying in front of her. He didn't ask. He pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and waited. Sloane didn't raise her voice. She didn't push the paper toward him, didn't ask whether he had known, didn't ask why no one had told her for 3 years. She asked only one question. If your grandmother hadn't told you to find me, would you ever have noticed me? Cassian looked at her. He didn't turn away. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't take even a second to consider his answer, because in all the years they had spent beside each other, he had never once told her something untrue, and he didn't intend to begin that night. He said no. Sloane nodded. She nodded only once, very slightly, like someone receiving back an object she had entrusted to another person for safekeeping. Then she stood. She went upstairs, took out the cloth bag, and packed into it exactly the things she had brought into that house long ago. Not one item more. She didn't cry. There was something more painful than being deceived, and it took her a long time to name it while she stood before the cabinet. Her entire former life had been arranged by other people, and she had learned the truth only after everything had collapsed. She had left that city, slept in her car, washed dishes until 3 o'clock in the morning, and told herself that this time, the small life she had rebuilt here belonged at least to her, from the kitchen to the man sitting in the corner. Now it turned out that a hand had placed that life before her too. She wasn't angry with Rosaria. She wasn't angry with her husband either. She simply couldn't bear the thought that once again she was standing inside a room someone else had prepared for her. She came downstairs with the bag over her shoulder. Cassian was still sitting in the same place. He stood as she passed him, and he didn't reach for her or say a word to make her stay. Only when she had reached the door did he speak. He said, "I won't come looking for you." Then he added that next Thursday, he would still be sitting in that corner of the kitchen. She didn't turn around. She opened the door and stepped outside. Beckett Moss arrived at the house the following afternoon carrying 2 briefcases instead of 1, and he didn't ask about the cloth bag that had left the house the night before. He spread the documents across the table and began with the part that was easiest to understand. Weston Ashcroft's restaurant chain had run out of capital years earlier, precisely during the period when it was expanding most rapidly, and no bank had been willing to provide more. The money had come from somewhere else. On the books, those funds appeared as investments from several companies with harmless-sounding names, and Beckett had traced each one backward until they all led to the same place in New Jersey, to the Salvatico family. From that point on, the restaurant chain was no longer merely a collection of restaurants. It became a place through which money moved. Cash revenue, hundreds of suppliers, invoices for fresh ingredients no one could ever fully count, all of it formed a perfect machine, and Weston's name was on every part of it. Beckett pointed to one column on the comparison sheet and said this was the part that truly mattered. Every month, an amount had to be covered from the legitimate revenue, an amount that appeared in no set of books, and it grew larger with each passing year. By the final year, it had become so large that there was no longer any way to conceal it unless costs were cut somewhere else by exactly the same amount. He turned to the next page, the terminated seafood supplier contract, and the date of that signature fell less than a week from the date when the hidden shortfall increased. Cassian looked at the 2 documents lying side by side. He said nothing. Then Beckett produced the final piece, and his voice changed. The sale of the restaurant chain to the Meridian Fund wasn't an exit. Meridian was raising capital for a new round, and the principal investor in that round was Barone Group. If the signing ceremony went forward, Barone money would purchase that exact machine, along with its entire history, along with every record for which the seller had preserved copies through all those years. Beckett said that the 5 years he had spent bringing everything into the light would disappear with a single signature, and the other side had been preparing for that day for a very long time. He sat down, removed his glasses, and wiped them clean, then said, "Sir, we didn't save your wife from them. Your wife just saved us by having a bucket of muddy water thrown over her." Cassian asked whether they could withdraw the investment immediately. Beckett shook his head. He said pulling out now would tell the other side that Cassian had seen the trap, while at this moment they still held his wife's face in their hands through that recording. They had to do the opposite. They had to deal with that first, then withdraw, and withdraw at the latest possible moment, so late that the seller would have no time to find another source of funding. Cassian stood and told Beckett to arrange a meeting. The meeting took place 3 nights later in a restaurant that had been closed since the afternoon. Every chair turned upside down on the tables except at 2 tables set apart from each other in the middle of the room. No one brought in a phone. No one brought in anything at all. The man seated at the other table was an old man with thinning hair, one hand resting on the head of a cane, and he spoke first, saying he had been waiting for this call since the recording began to spread. He said he didn't care about the man selling the restaurants, referred to him with a contemptuous word, then waved one hand and said that men like him spoke the loudest when everything was calm, and when trouble came, they spent the entire night calling people who no longer wanted to listen. Then he named his price. "Let go. Allow the signing to proceed as scheduled, and your wife will be left in peace." Cassian listened to everything. Then he placed a file on the table, pushed it across, and said it contained the harbor operating rights their two families had fought over since the previous generation. He said he was offering it as a way to bring the old matter to an end. The old man across from him looked at the file. He didn't reach for it. He left it lying untouched on the table until the silence had said everything that needed to be said, and Cassian understood that this had never been about business. He took the file back. Then he said, in the same voice he had used when he first sat down, that decades of records belonging to both families were stored in different law offices, accompanied by instructions to break the seals if anything happened to him or his wife. He said, "I still have enough time to serve out my part. You don't." Then he stood, and he spoke his final words, saying that the Barone family gave only one warning, and this was it. He was the last person to leave the room, after turning off the lights. Sloane rented her old room again on the second floor of the house where she had once lived, and during those days she continued working, continued baking bread, except that she went to the shelter only on mornings that weren't Thursdays. Yvonne didn't ask. Priya called every evening. By the third week, on a night when she couldn't sleep, Sloane lay staring at the ceiling and realized that the thing she feared most, the thought that her life had once again been arranged by someone else, was exactly what she was now doing to herself, because she was allowing a 3-year-old piece of paper to make her decision for her. The following morning was Thursday. She rose early, drove there, and went around to the back door as she always had. She stood on the step for a while before pushing it open. Inside, the low stool had already been pulled from the corner, and Cassian was sitting beside the bin of potatoes, peeling slowly and steadily, one after another, exactly as he had said he would. He didn't look up when the door opened. He finished peeling the potato in his hand, set it down, and only then raised his eyes to her. Neither of them said anything. Sloane walked to the kitchen table, tied on her apron, and began the morning's batch of dough. That afternoon, she went to Rosaria's house. The old woman was sitting in the chair beside the window, and she pointed to the chair across from her before Sloane had time to speak. She said she knew Sloane had found the paper. Then she continued without evasion, saying that years ago she had read the newspapers, had seen Sloane's face printed there, and had remembered something from her own life when she first came to this country, something she didn't explain, saying only that no one had been willing to listen to her finish a single sentence. She said she had paid the law office and had never intended for anyone to know. She said that later, when she heard Sloane had come to this city, she called her grandson into the kitchen, told him to find her, instructed him not to reveal who he was, not to give her money, only to make certain that she had enough to eat. Sloane sat in silence. Rosaria braced one hand against the arm of the chair, leaned forward, and said, "I told him to find you. I didn't tell him to sit there for 3 months. I didn't tell him to wake before dawn every Thursday. And I certainly didn't tell him to fall in love with you." When she finished, she leaned back and told Sloane to pour her a glass of water. That evening, Sloane went home. Neither of them spoke about the 3 weeks that had just passed. She cooked dinner. They sat and ate. And she told him about the trip to the old man's house in the small town. Told him about the shoebox. Told him what the old man had called after her from the front steps. Cassian listened to everything. He didn't ask a single question. That night, after she had gone upstairs, he went down to his study and called Beckett. He ordered Barone Group's entire investment withdrawn from Meridian's funding round, signed every document that needed his signature, and the official notice was sent before dawn. The loss caused by withdrawing so late was so large that Beckett read the figure aloud twice over the phone, and Cassian only said that he had heard him clearly. He didn't tell his wife a word about it. The following morning was the day of the signing. The grand ballroom of the Marchmont Hotel was filled to capacity, with a stage, a large screen, and several cameras from local television stations broadcasting the closing session live. Weston Ashcroft walked onto the stage with the stride of a man who had been rehearsing his speech of thanks for days. He placed the document case on the table, opened the locks, turned to the final section, to the place where the investor's signed guarantee should have been. There was no guarantee there. There was only another page, newly printed and stamped with that day's date, a notice withdrawing the guarantee that had been delivered before sunrise. He read it. Then he read it again. The representative from Meridian rose from the front row, walked onto the stage, and said into the microphone that the principal investor had withdrawn its entire commitment. And under those circumstances, there was nothing left to sign that day. The ballroom erupted in noise, then fell silent. Weston asked for the name. He asked more loudly than necessary, asked again, and the representative lowered his eyes to the page in his hand and read it aloud. Barone Group. The entire ballroom was still stirring at the name that had just been read aloud when the doors at the far end opened. The person who entered wasn't anyone the people in that room had been expecting. It was a woman walking alone, wearing a faded shirt, her hair tied neatly back, a file case held against her chest, and she moved straight between the 2 rows of seats without looking to either side. Several paces behind her came another woman and an elderly man walking slowly, one hand resting on the backs of the chairs for support. The television cameras turned to follow them. Weston recognized her while she was still halfway across the room from the stage, and he stood there with the notice, withdrawing the guarantee still in his hand, unable to say anything at all. Sloane stepped onto the stage, placed the file case on the presiding table, and said into the microphone that she hadn't come to demand money. She had come to take back her name. Then she opened the case. She removed the first item, a sworn statement signed before a notary 2 days earlier by the health inspector who had signed the final report that year, in which he testified that the storage log had been replaced before he arrived, that he knew it when he signed, and who had paid him. She removed the second item, an accounting comparison prepared by the legal office of Barone Group, placing side by side the date the supplier contract had been terminated and the date the monthly off-the-books payment had increased, the 2 dates separated by less than 1 week. She removed the third item, the complete medical examination file of a man who had spent his life teaching, a file that for 3 years no one outside his family had ever read. She read each document one by one, slowly and clearly, without adding a single word of commentary. And she didn't repeat one word about what had happened that night. She didn't need to. There were people in that ballroom who had read every article about the case, and they needed only those 3 documents to understand what no one had been willing to see for 3 years. No one cleared their throat. The cameras never moved away from the stage. She added that copies of all 3 documents had been submitted to the State Health Board and to the federal investigative authorities early that morning, before the ceremony began, and she read out the receipt numbers. In the second row, Weston's attorney sprang to his feet. He began talking about jurisdiction, about how this wasn't the proper place to present such material, about procedure. In the last row, near the doors, a man stood. He said nothing. He only removed the watch from his wrist and placed it on the back of the chair in front of him. Few people in the room understood what that meant, but the attorney did, and he sat down, and he didn't open his mouth again for the rest of the proceedings. Priya Vance stepped onto the stage. She held the microphone with both hands and said, "I hated the wrong person for 3 years, and if anyone here is still blaming this woman, please listen to everything I have to say before you leave this room." Then she spoke about her father, about the work he had done, about how for 3 years she had possessed a name upon which to place her anger, and about the night she opened the brown envelope. When she reached that point, she had to stop for a while. No one in the ballroom stood to leave. Mr. Reiner, seated in the front row, gave his testimony as well, much more briefly, and the final thing he said was that he had once believed he was selling only a signature. The ceremony never resumed. Everything that followed was swift and cold. That afternoon, Cassian made exactly 1 call, to the person in charge of logistics for Barone Group, and he spoke for less than half a minute. No ban was issued, and no one called anyone else with instructions. It was simply that 2 days later, not a single truck arrived at the back doors of Weston Ashcroft's restaurants, and when his people called everywhere, every place was busy. Every place had just run out of stock. Every place told them to try again the following week. By the 3rd day, they had to close 2 restaurants because the kitchens were empty. The bank withdrew the line of credit at the end of that week, after the live broadcast from the Marchmont Ballroom had been replayed on 3 channels. The board held an emergency meeting at the beginning of the following week and removed him from his executive position, and they didn't allow him to finish his statement. Camille came to the shelter late one weekend afternoon, after most of the people had left the kitchen. She stood at the back door, not daring to step fully inside, and she spoke very quickly, saying that every brand had terminated its contract with her, that her name had been removed from every list, and that all Sloane needed to do was say 1 sentence to the press, 1 sentence stating that Camille had had nothing to do with what happened 3 years earlier, and everything would be different. Sloane wiped her hands on a towel and looked at her. She looked for a very long time, long enough that Camille had to lower her eyes to the floor. Then Sloane said that long ago, Odette had opened the door for both of them at 4 o'clock in the morning, and that today, she would still open the door if Camille was hungry. She could come inside and sit down, and Sloane would serve her a meal, but she wouldn't say a single word on Camille's behalf. She said there were some doors people had to walk through on their own. Camille remained there a little longer, then turned away, and Sloane didn't call her back. That fall, federal investigators opened a case into the network that had moved money through the restaurant chain, and Weston Ashcroft was the only person whose name appeared on every document. Not a single law office in Philadelphia agreed to defend him. Some said their schedules were full, others didn't respond at all, and everyone in the profession understood that taking the case would mean placing their own name beside another name in New Jersey. He would have to bear all of it. Sloane learned about it from a brief news report, which she read one morning between 2 batches of bread. 3 days later, she told Beckett Moss that she wanted to pay an out-of-state law firm, one good enough that no one would dare dismiss it, and she wanted the arrangement to carry no trace of her name. Beckett set down his cup of coffee. He objected, and he objected fiercely, saying that no one had ever done such a thing, that this was the man who had stood before the cameras 3 years earlier and spoken the word that destroyed her, and that if the truth came out, everything she had just reclaimed would be discussed in an entirely different way. He said he couldn't understand it. Cassian sat at the head of the table and listened to everything, and he asked his wife only one question. Why? Sloane didn't answer immediately. She sat down, placed both hands on the table, and said that she didn't forgive that man, that she had never forgiven him and probably never would. She said that 3 years earlier, an old woman she had never met had paid for her attorney, a complete stranger who owed her nothing. She said that for 3 years, she had thought of that gift as an act of kindness that had come from somewhere far away, and now she understood that if she merely accepted it and kept it for herself, it would forever remain the kindness of one person toward another. She said, "If I don't do the same thing for someone I have no desire to help, then her gift is only kindness. But if I do, it becomes a circle." Then she added one more sentence, more softly, saying that someone had once told her every company had to pay a price in exchange for something greater, and she didn't want to live according to that belief, not even when the person being made to pay was the man himself. Cassian said nothing more. He nodded to Beckett. The law firm accepted the case the following week, and it was only because an attorney was sitting beside him that Weston Ashcroft finally dared to open his mouth, finally dared to reveal the names he had been too afraid to speak for all those years, even when he was alone, and the case in New Jersey began from there. Sloane discovered the price her husband had paid entirely by accident one afternoon, when she passed his study and heard Beckett repeating the amount lost by withdrawing the investment so late to someone over the phone. She stood in the hallway and listened to everything. Cassian had never said a word to her about it. That evening, she didn't thank him. She went into the kitchen and cooked a simple stew, the kind Odette used to make when the weather turned, then filled 2 plates and carried them both to the table. She placed one in front of him and the other across from it, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He looked at her. She picked up her fork first. He ate every bite. A few days later, her phone rang in the morning, and Rosaria said a single sentence in Italian before hanging up, a sentence Sloane had to ask someone to translate, and it meant, "Now you are family." By winter, the free vocational baking class opened in the shelter kitchen for women who had just emerged from chapters of their lives they didn't wish to describe. 9 women attended the first session. Delaney stood at the head of the table, teaching them how to dust flour across the work surface, letting it fall from high above, not flinging their hands, not rushing. Priya brought coffee and stayed until the class ended. In one corner of the room, an older man quietly wiped the tables and arranged the chairs. No one introduced him, and he said nothing. Cassian sat in his usual place with the bin of potatoes beside him. On the small board hanging near the door, the name of the class had been written in chalk, a single word, Odette's. A person's honor can be taken away in a single evening, but it may take years to reclaim, so we must be careful about what we say of others when they aren't present to defend themselves. True power doesn't lie in the ability to destroy someone, but in possessing the strength to destroy them and still choosing the path of truth. And the way a person treats someone they believe can no longer offer them anything reveals who they truly are. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it so that we'll have more encouragement to bring you meaningful stories every day. How did Sloane's story make you feel? And would you have done what she did? Please leave a comment, as we would love to read your thoughts. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.